Welcome to the Here's Waldo podcast, where we sit down with top visionaries and creatives in the video game industry. Together, we'll unravel their journeys and learn more about the path they're forging ahead. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hi, I'm Lizzie Ventus, founder and CEO of Here's Waldo Recruiting, a boutique video game recruitment firm. This is the Here's Waldo podcast. In every episode, we dive deep into conversations with creatives, founders, and executives about what it's taken them to be successful. You can expect to hear valuable lessons from the journey and get a glimpse into the future of the industry. This episode is brought to you by Here's Waldo Recruiting, a boutique recruitment firm for the game industry. We value quality over quantity, transparency, communication, and diversity. Today, we have Shawn Foust with us. Shawn is the COO of Fortis and focuses on product, publishing, community, and corporate development. He has managed to work in games for over a decade, often resorting to founding companies so he has a place to work. Shawn's very funny too. Throughout his career, he's worked as a lawyer, business developer, a game designer, a producer, a founder, an executive, and a wandering sage, consultant of dubious value. He's won a few, he's lost a few. Throughout all of these ups and downs, he remains passionate about games as a creative medium and a way to bring people together. Fortis, as a global remote company working in their design lane, is an attempt to follow that passion at a grand scale. In his free time, he writes blogs and biographies about himself in third person, which is not weird at all. Shawn, thank you so much for your humor and for being here.
It's the simple things in life, Lizzie, like drafting a autobiography for yourself for your profile that is wildly over the top, which I had a lot of fun doing that.
You're the best person on LinkedIn because you're so funny and you're just yourself and you don't take it too seriously. So if anyone doesn't follow Shawn, you must. And I'm still waiting, by the way, you posted that you need a different headshot from the glowering selfie from your yard, but you didn't even update it. What's up?
I actually have a potential update to that potential poll, which I think has the potential to shake the industry at its core. I'm just waiting for the right moment to drop it. Yeah, I find LinkedIn this very interesting environment where I really get excited by algorithmic seeds and how they develop over time and how certain rituals and lore and practice kind of come to define those feeds over time. And I feel like the LinkedIn feed has achieved this very unique sort of style of performance. And I find interacting and trolling with that ecosystem borderline irresistible, which is why I try to keep my interactions with it limited because I really have a hard time not posting.
It's fun. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, so any humor is always much appreciated. Odd profile pictures, funny stuff in your bio. Good. Okay, so tell everybody about Fortis Games.
So Fortis is, I think, an interesting outgrowth from an interesting period of time. Following the end of my time at Warner Brothers, it was still the height of the pandemic, and there's a lot of interesting things happening at that time and place, right? Games are experiencing this massive surge because so many people are stuck inside of their homes. They're also experiencing this massive surge because this massive influx of capital around Web3 at that period of time. And there's just a lot of questions in my head around where work was going as well and how people are going to interact and what kind of models you could use. Prior to the pandemic, I had never really considered the idea of remote work seriously. It hadn't been something that I'd spent a lot of time thinking about. And all of a sudden this was all there. And the question was, all right, what do you do? You've left a safe job with a highly reputable company making interesting games for millions of people. Seems like a bad idea. What are you going to do with that? And that started a conversation between Steve Chang and myself, who's my partner in Fortis. And that began this question around what were the assumptions that the industry were governed by and how many of them did we think were still true? And a couple of things that really resonated between the two of us was we felt that decision making around creative products had sort of entered a rut that was really harming the US game ecosystem in particular, but I think broader than that. We felt there were a lot of assumptions around talent and where you could find it and how it might be stitched together into creative teams that were potentially no longer true, in part because of the pandemic, but in part because of things like cost structure and how that works when you're trying to create creative products and the risks that's associated with the ups and downs of doing that. Also, just how decisions and leadership worked. There was a style of leader that I think does traditionally pretty well by traditional metrics. And I've been the beneficiary of that, like being able to speak on your feet pretty well, to charismatically present a vision. Like those things are major advantages, but they're not the only things that matter in a leader. And I think that a lot of these other things we felt potentially became more important in a remote environment. For example, the ability to sit there and think deeply about a topic and communicate about it carefully and thoughtfully, the ability to lead through different styles of communication or work. And so like these things kind of like all boiled together into a belief that perhaps you could found a new developer that was oriented against a different set of principles. And I've laid that out in some of the blogs, but really what we're trying to say is, hey, we think this global remote approach could work. We think that taking a cross section of humanity's talent and putting it into this environment around the idea that many genres have stagnated, many games have found an audience, but that audience has been left with really nothing new for a long period of time. But there's an opportunity around design and investing in that and thinking about the tough problems like that really animated the initial pitch. And we went out looking for partners and it was interesting. Like the entire journey was interesting. I can't tell you how much people wanted us to fall within a certain set of patterns that were understood. And ultimately we found the partner that made a lot of sense for us. And that's been great. And this is what we've been doing for the last 2.5 years.
Congrats on finding your partner. What was that journey like? I mean, you said that you picked the person that aligned with you most. And I think there are a lot of people, especially right now, that are so desperate for capital that becomes maybe less of a consideration. Can you talk about how you ensure that you found the right partner?
I think part of going out looking for capital really comes down to the principles at play for what you will accept. And those principles, I think, tend to be related really strongly to what you're passionate about, what your history, what your network is like. And it has a pretty significant impact on the ability to get capital. So for example, I think it's gotten better over the last 5 years, but geography has a pretty significant impact on availability of capital. Money wants to move in places where it is easy to understand what's going to happen to that money, what the protections are, right? Like well-ordered regulatory regimes, all these things like stack up. So that's like a principle where it's like, if I'm a VC, do I want to figure out a novel corporate structure in a place I don't understand? So that already splits the world pretty quickly between a set of haves and have-nots. And then you start to layer on more things, which is what network do you have? Do you know these people on a personal level? Do you come referred to them by trusted intermediaries? Typically they're founders, right? Do you have a pitch that fits into a pattern that they believe is investable? The industry, I think, is predominated by a group of people that are very strong at pattern recognition, less strong at pattern creation. And so the general idea is that if you're going to go out for capital and you can't frame what you're doing within a pattern that makes sense, you're going to have a harder time unless the caliber of your team is so high that people are essentially saying, hey, the pattern I'm investing in is just the team, right?
Yeah.
And I think that has really dramatic implications for who is likely to get capital and what the options are going to be. And when things are flush, things expand outward a little bit, it gets a little bit easier for a broader group of people to potentially get capital. And when things become difficult, well, there's a flight to safety. And I think that's really what we've seen over the last year. When we were coming out, the industry was flush. Steve has a good reputation, have a reasonable reputation. And I think it made it possible for us to pitch a broader set of ideas than what would normally be available to most people. And even then, I think we found an atypical backer, and that was based off of a very strong alignment around what our goals were. And that's probably advice that I think I offered to most people, which is you just don't know where the right partner is going to come from. And it is better to go broad and then work from the options that you have, as opposed to go narrow and don't consider alternatives.
Yeah, just like finding a job, you know about all these companies. Maybe you should go broad, check out other stuff. It'll surprise you.
I absolutely take that approach. I have never taken the best offer from the best company that's been given to me, right? I've almost always ended up going in places that seemed atypical, that other folks didn't quite understand at the time, but was based off of a set of things that I cared about a lot. I think some people, what they care about is safety and security and a resume that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. I think there are good things to optimize for. I have tended, certainly once I left law, to focus more on, well, if I wanted to do the sensible thing, I should have stayed as a lawyer. Now that I've done the nonsensical thing, how do I optimize for the things that I really do care about, right? And so a lot of that's put into Fortis. I think there's a very strong commercial argument behind everything we do. I don't think you should found companies without understanding how you're going to ultimately drive a good outcome. But at the same time, there's a lot of ways to drive those outcomes, and I've optimized for the ways that I think resonate with me more.
Sounds like you're in really clear alignment of what you want to do and the way you want to do things. So I like that. You're classic on
self-reflection, sitting on cliff sides, looking out over the ocean, pondering me. That's usually how these things come about.
No, they're hard questions to answer, and they do take a lot of thought. You can be on a cliffside, you can be wherever, but it is so important to think about that. Otherwise, you're just on a ride on a bus, but you're not driving. So your funding mission is unique. Can you talk more about what Fortis is making for anybody that's not super aware, and then your unique structure?
Yeah, we haven't put a lot out there yet. Our games are moving towards that point where we're going to start putting them out there, and that's exciting. Generally, we have a few things that we really care about. I really care about the accessibility of the experience. So we'll always be on the phone, we'll always be free to play. That's not to say that the other experiences aren't amazing. I play a ton of them. They are fantastic, but there is something really specific around the world in a game that excites me. I think there's a really good business associated with it. It's a tough business, but I really, really think it's fascinating that 100 million people, 1 billion people can play the same game. That's just boggles my mind. There's been no point in human history where that's ever been true. And it's something that I've really spent a lot of my career trying to figure out how to get more people into spaces where people from different backgrounds, different creeds, races, whatever, right, have a place where they can communicate and interact. And I think ideally, collectively problem solve in ways that I think are worth having, because it restores some faith in humanity at times. We have a number of games in development, and so we'll start putting them out there in the upcoming years. Some will be cross-platform, some will be just focused on the phone. It sort of depends on the experience and the audience that we're going for. Quite broad on genre and demographics, and that's partly just when we started the company. It was certainly a time and place where a lot was in transition. And so part of it is giving the portfolio enough range that it could survive significant shifts inside of the industry. So
I like it.
Yeah, that was the theory, at least. So we'll see how it plays out.
We'll see it rocket. Maybe they'll be back on the cliff pondering.
That's right.
Just kidding. Okay, so your team is remote, and I know you're a global team. And remote work is a very hot topic in the recruiting world these days. Some are 5 days a week RTO. Many companies are mandating it. Some are still fully remote. I'd love to hear about how you implemented remote work. And I know it was a time when that was just obviously what you were doing in the pandemic, but
Yeah.
global remote work is a whole other set of challenges. So how have you gone about assembling a remote team, and how have you overcome some of the inevitable challenges that come with bringing people together from different parts of the world, different backgrounds, different beliefs, systems entirely?
I mean, it's certainly a learning curve. Um, couple of thoughts up front. Um, I think remote is doable, but I think it's different on a couple of different levels, and how it's experienced depends quite a lot on who you are, your background, and I think it's worth mentioning up front. For example, it doesn't surprise me at all that managers want to go back to the office generally, because managing is much worse in a remote environment. So much of the reason why people become managers are because they like the people dynamics of a job, and they like the impact and the feedback that they get. They are often high EQ, right? People that can really get a lot out of the signals and tells that exist inside of an in-person conversation. And losing that really blunts your feeling of effectiveness as a manager. And since as a manager, I think people tend to probably overly associate their personal feelings with how everyone else is feeling about it. I think being an individual contributor is better if you are remote, if you are senior, or at least out of the junior portion of your career, right? And the ability to have a personal space that is well designed and well suited to you being productive and having fewer distractions, I think is a significant value add, particularly for people that deal with things like social anxiety and any number of other things that make a work in like an office environment actually a bit more challenging, right? Artists, I often come across artists. You need a certain lighting. You need a certain level of focus. You need a certain level of consistency in what you're doing, and that's just harder to achieve in an in-person environment. Now, the part that's rough for our industry is that so much of the industry is built off of creative trust, and creative trust is much, much harder to come by in a remote environment. What we have found is that you have to make a couple of pretty significant changes to how you recruit and sort of interact with people. The first is there's enough, sociology out there to suggest that when a person comes into any space, there's a natural desire to conform. Right? You just don't want to be the odd one out when 10 people are doing something. My favorite exercise is like an elevator, and everyone's facing the wrong way, and eventually the person turns around and faces the same way as everyone else, even though it's the wrong way and they kind of know it's the wrong way, but it doesn't matter because the act of standing facing the other way is really sort of alienating and feels really bad, right? That's what our office does in certain respects, is that it just constantly pulls people towards the core of what the company is. So they can be much further away from that core when they start, and eventually they're going to get there. Remote, that's not true, right? Really what you are is another Zoom screen. And as much as you try to push culture into each one of those Zoom calls, there's nothing quite like showing up in an office and feeling like this is how this place works and getting that immediate constant feedback. So we had to be a lot more specific about who we would hire. We realized that people needed to naturally already be exhibiting the style and way of working that we wanted, as well as the sort of set of cultural values that we cared most about. So our solution to that was we implemented a prompt system for literally everything. Like every single hire that you have, every executive, it doesn't matter. I have executives that I've known and I treasure and I love, that I've worked with, for years. All of them had to go through the prompt process, right? And what we're solving for is, listen, this is remote. You're going to communicate asynchronously more often than you're used to. We have time zones that are spread across, 10 hours, right? You need to be effective in communicating this way, in structuring and thinking this way. we also have found that if you're going to work across a number of different cultures, the odds that someone is working in their second or third language is much higher. And giving people the opportunity to think and write and to completely own the communication that they're going to send to you, right? Without the immediate pressure of, hey, this pause after I asked you this question has gone on for more than 4 seconds and now it's awkward, right? That just enables a much broader group of people to potentially join the company. So we've used prompting extensively. We have modeled the prompts around being very open-ended. And that's mostly like an invitation for a person to say, hey, this is how I think about an ambiguous open-ended topic. Here's how I organize an abstract idea down into a specific viewpoint on a thing. And we're really looking for people that we want to think beside. So we value experience, we value resume, we value, soft skill communication, but I'd say we value it a lot less than your standard company, which might really highly index off of a few half-hour conversations for making a decision and a resume. And that's really made a huge change in how successful we are in recruiting people. And we've gotten a lot better at understanding it. There's some group of people that don't want to do that work up front. And I'm like, great, you'd hate it here. Like, I know for sure you would hate it here. There's some people that are concerned around like, hey, are you getting free work from us? I was like, listen, I've just asked you about the most unique thing you've learned in the industry for the last 3 years. 90% of the time, it's going to have no relevance to anything that we are doing. And really what I'm trying to figure out is, do you have an insightful thing? Do you have something to add to the conversation? You can choose anything you want, right? And so like what I find is it's just a helpful filtering mechanism that people are going to work well at Fortis really want to answer these questions and really want to have the space and time to think and offer a communication that they think is authentic to them, rather than what's your greatest weakness? Oh, I work too much, like getting out of that performative interview and into a real conversation.
I like that. Thank you. I work with so many startups that are trying to figure out how to hire. And so it's always nice to hear from somebody that has scaled their company. How big is Fortis now? How many people? LinkedIn says
We're
355.
about Yeah. We're like a little bit north of 350 right now. Right. Yeah.
Right. In under 3 years. So that's incredible. You clearly have the system process down. And this is really
I don't know if we have that. I think what we have is like we've moved from V1 to V7 on a journey that's probably got 15 versions or more, but we've gotten better about what matters. And we've gotten more confident about it as the data sort of reflects the rough conclusions that we've been drawing. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can look at your own data too. And I think so important for everyone that's running a company. How many people do you talk to? And how many people do you screen? How many people do you interview? How many people make it to different processes, different stages in your interview? And then how many do you hire? Because if your numbers are really bad, maybe you think you're looking for someone really unique, but maybe you also don't have it figured out, It's a lot.
It's really interesting. Like another thing that I do in this company I haven't done before is that I don't actively try to tell people to join. Right. When I was a startup, it was really around like pitching, getting people excited and motivated, like come over here, it'll be great, blah, blah, blah. Like
Sure.
Here, it's very much like, if you don't like anything that you're hearing, just don't continue. Right. Like, Lizzie, like we get like 5,000-6,000 applications a week. Right. Like we're not like, we're like people want to work in a remote environment that allows them to be creative. People across the world have talent, but they don't have equal access to opportunity. Like a global remote company that gives them the opportunity, right, is exciting and motivating. And so what we've just learned is you really have to be motivated to work in a certain way and be excited in a certain way. And like creative choices, like what company you go to, that's just a really personal thing. And we really want people to be really happy on the other side of making the choice. And we don't get it right every time. Like not everything is perfect, but I do think we've gotten better.
Right. I like the prompts. That's very unique. And your thought on global remote work too. I think a lot of companies that I talk to for recruiting are trying to figure out the best way to go about remote work, because from a talent perspective, the pandemic is the best thing that ever happened. I recruited people to Bend, Oregon. I recruited people to specific areas in LA, which that's a complete nightmare. They're like, oh, I had the map. I used to have the map on my desk when I used to work
Yeah.
for a company in the office. They're like, oh, I live, I don't know, whatever area in LA. And that would be a 2-hour commute each way. It's just so crazy
Yeah.
to think about. So worlds are,
It's,
you have so
uh,
much better, more access to truly the best people.
yeah. And I also think there's just a reality around cost structure that people aren't talking about. It's been a long time since California has produced a scale successful game company. And I don't think
Fired.
people ever talk about it that much, but think about it. Like when is the last company that really broke out and became massive out of California, right? Was it Riot? It's like what, 10, 12 years ago, right? Like
I think it was
there's
a lot before that, right?
there's just, when I look at the math of it, especially once you move into live operations and these types of things, and you're competing against places that have cost structure that are like half or a third or fifth, right? I think it has like a significant impact and like the ability to take bets, to generate new things. And that's something that I've been fixated on. I love California. I love the talent. I love the people. There's a lot to be said about it,
Sure.
but there is a core math problem around how do you sustain scale and build it. And I think it's got pretty challenging in California over time.
Plus, it's the worst from a tax and business ops perspective.
There's a number of things that stack up.
Yeah.
I still think the talent pool and the base is,
It's incredible.
to say it's incredible, right?
It is.
But
I got to know.
you've got to solve for multiple layers of the problem, right? It's not just, hey, is there talent that is capable of making a great game? I think that talent exists. Is there talent that's capable of making a great game for less than $50 million? I'm more skeptical unless you start to introduce pretty significant changes in platform or production needs. So I could believe that a really great game could be built out of AI potentially. I could believe that if a new platform popped up, that the cost structure would drop down a bit. But for anything that's got a reasonable level of maturity, I think the expenses matter.
The math doesn't math. Well, I think now is a big time. It's a big shift, big time of change, big time of rethinking things. The pandemic was too, that people really have to look at alternative ways to get their game done. And there are some success stories lately and a lot of failures. So how can you analyze those? What can you learn?
Yeah.
You have some good ideas. So
they're ideas. They're principles by which I've made decisions, Lizzie. I don't think I'm like an oracle in this industry. I just think you got to make decisions and you got to try to like figure out how to build businesses, because I think we all know that this industry is up and down, and I've had to lay people off before. I'm sure at some point in the future I will have to again, and it is a uniquely unpleasant experience. There's nothing better than giving someone their first job in games. There's nothing worse than taking that job away.
Yeah. So today is a good day to talk about that. I was just noodling on a semi-offensive LinkedIn post about it. But gosh, there have been companies that have done it in horrific manners lately and deleted their entire company existence, done crazy stuff like that. So do you have any insights into the best ways to execute a layoff from your experience that you can share? It's an unpleasant situation, but there's for sure an optimal way to do it where people may want to even come back and work with you.
I think there's any number of ways to approach the topic. And I think so much of it is driven by circumstance. Like a lot of the messier layoffs tend to be, the decision was left for too long and there really is no other options than doing something quite harsh. Now the question was like, should they have done something less harsh 2 months earlier? And I don't know, right? Like I tend to empathize with the group that is laid off pretty deeply, having experienced personally myself in the past. And I also tend to empathize with the managers and the executives making the decision. There are some people that, you know what, they're narcissistic sociopaths. They don't care about anyone. It's only about them. They just want more profit. Yeah, sure, fine. Frankly, most people that I think want to go in games and build careers don't fall into that profile. And so the decision to do a layoff is excruciating, and they tend to put it off for very long until there are no other options. And then it tends to be pretty harsh and underworked relative to a really solid communication. And, you know what? It's super easy to judge the outputs of these things.
Totally.
But I certainly
No,
not inclined to.
it is. And I think that unless you operate a business, I mean, no one can really understand the hard business decisions that you have to make all the time and the sleepless nights that come with that. And I do see posts that are crabby about layoffs. And that it's understandable that people impacted by layoffs are crabby. But I do think that there's a way for management to own up and communicate. I mean, if someone's like, hey, this is what happened, here's where we are, mistakes were made, it is unfortunate, let me know how I can help you. That's a very different message than like an email on a Sunday night and being locked out and no other communication.
I think a lot of so that's true. I think a lot of what makes things particularly painful now was that so much of the market was hinged off of growth for so long that it was like hiring and how you thought about it was really around how do you keep on generating growth. And with the increase in rates and everything else that's going on in the background, all of a sudden the pendulum swung and it was now about profit. And so much of the layoffs are really around saying, listen, I, as an executive or as a manager, am now valued off of my margin as opposed to my ability to produce growth. And as a result of that, I am executing a layoff in order to increase margin. I'm going to go from a 10% margin to a 20% margin, right? And that's really, really brutal. Because essentially what the person on the other side of that layoff is looking at is, I am basically being traded in order to meet this number like incrementally up, right? And I don't actually think there's a good way to navigate the frustration around that. Like there's a reality around high rates and environments that create a flight towards safety, which is a flight towards margin, and a flight towards margin and the incentives that are associated with that tends to be cutting, often overcutting in order to get to a place where you have a fairly strong balance sheet. And I don't think any worker can ever really be told in that sort of environment, like, hey, you should feel all right about us making this balance sheet improvement. Like it's just not like a really graceful way of doing it. And I think that's what a number of companies are going through and doing right now. And I get the frustration, right?
On both sides. Yeah. It's hard.
I get how these things happen. Yeah. I appreciate how they happen. I see the incentives and I just tend to think people always follow their incentives, and those incentives often generate outcomes that are unsatisfying when they're misaligned between, leadership and employee.
It's true. Good insight. I want to hear about your career as a lawyer. So many people in my podcast have started their career in law and then transitioned to be an executive in games. But you graduated and you worked in law in games for a while, right?
Yeah. I started out as an entertainment attorney in LA working for Shepherd Mullen, which is a pretty well-regarded law firm. I never expected to end up in entertainment. That wasn't really my goal. It just sort of happened. And I found the movie industry to be really fantastic if you really loved movies, but I wasn't really that. I was more of a gaming nerd. And so I asked my firm to let me try to build a practice around video games. They were super generous and supportive. Eventually, I moved into that industry because mobile and social kind of popped up at the same time. I made that transition. Really lucky for me because it really changed the nature of the industry. And then relatively quickly, I started interacting with my clients and just realized I began to like the business side of the conversation more than I liked the legal side. The legal side was like fascinating and interesting, but the heart wants what the heart wants. So ultimately, I made the decision to leave kind of like during the height of the Great Recession. Again, terrible idea. On the other side of that, I got laid off 6 months later, which didn't feel great. So this is what I mean about the empathy for people that are dealing with it. Like, I think the person doing the layoffs was really hard for them. I think being laid off didn't feel good either. I think it hits self-identity in a pretty serious way. And it was just a question of what I wanted to do after that. And so the obvious solution was just go back to the law firm, didn't take the obvious solution, sort of double down on trying to figure things out, started up a company, tried to get it rolling, didn't really go anywhere. And then ultimately joined another company called at that time, PlayMesh. And from there, I transitioned into, eventually being a game designer and then a product person, and then eventually became the CEO of that.
Was that Quark Games?
That became Quark Games. Yeah, rebranded.
Okay. So you took a entry-ish level role in games after law?
So I became a general counsel / head of business development. And then at the next company at PlayMesh, I had that same role. But while I was doing that role, I would sit in on product meetings and offer like thoughts or suggestions. And eventually the CEO said, hey, like, why don't you try designing some of the stuff and seeing what you think? And so then I started to do that sort of work and eventually became a product owner. And then when the CEO took a step back, the other founders put me forward to be CEO, and that was Quark. And some of my closest working partners from that time still work with me today, and people like Carol Liao and Calvin.
Best. Truly, especially when you're in a remote environment and you have those people you've worked with forever. And then Quark got acquired by Machine Zone. I'd love to hear more about that interaction because I think game company sales are not really talked about so much. So what can you say from that experience?
It was really interesting because Machine Zone worked in the 4X space, which PlayMesh / Quark had worked in for a long time. And they had brought that space to like a much, much higher level of like economic outcome, right? Like it was, Machine Zone was a machine, right?
Yeah.
And head up by a CEO named Gabe Layden, who I think just had this very, strong, bold vision for what that space could accomplish. So they were familiar from us from the work that we had done before. And ultimately, when we were looking for what we're going to do next with the company, it sparked up that conversation. It ultimately led to the acquisition of the company. And I think some number of people that were part of that acquisition are still there, have become leaders in that company. And that's really cool. Like when a pairing works out, like I think that's always just a pretty hopeful. It's nice. It's nice when it worked out on the other side, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely feels good. It's fun for me when you hire someone and then you see them get promoted. I mean, the same thing in a different lens, but it's super gratifying. So obviously so many things went right at Quark. You got promoted, you sold the company. I always like to highlight in the podcast that being a founder is not always as glamorous as people might think, maybe often not as glamorous as people might think. Do you have any stories from just ups and downs of running that business that you could share? Hard decisions, issues you had to overcome, death situations.
The most enjoyable, exciting, enticing time of a startup is when you have the original idea. And it's pretty much all downhill from there.
Yeah.
Like the idea of doing it is fun because it's not really confined by the reality of doing it. Right. And once you start, then there's a honeymoon phase of, oh my gosh, I'm doing it. This is great. I'm always doing this thing. I always wanted to do this. Okay. It's fantastic. And then the honeymoon phase gives then a way eventually to the realities of executing. Okay, I spent a while on this. I've put time and capital and energy into this, and I need to convert it into an outcome. And that's really like where a lot of the founder struggles come from, where a lot of the emotional sort of like ups and downs begin to really start to surface. And the transition into like real execution and the outputs, and trying to find product market fit, I think is brutal. And when you don't find product market fit, I think it's one of the most uniquely excruciating experiences that I can describe. In games, it's doubly so. It really feels so much like a personal rejection of your effort to creatively put something out there. And and then it's doubled up often with the feedback is very clear and immediate in games. Like you watch the games, people don't seem to be into it. It's done. It's very hard to go from no one is interested in something to like a bunch of people are interested in something. It's not impossible, but it's very unlikely.
Yeah.
And that then is often coupled with I failed and now I have to find a way to keep the company going. So you have to stay at the company and then you have to lay off a lot of people whose greatest sin was believing in your vision in the first place. Right. And that's like, I can't tell you how horrible it feels. Right. The first view is like, well, like, man, can I just fire myself? And the answer is no. So much of the credibility of the company is tied up in you being there and figuring it out and solving it. Right. But you're sitting there dealing with this massive like fraud. Why did I do this? Why did I have other people do this? Like you feel awful. And then simultaneously you're letting go of people that you really believed in and they really believed in you. And that feels doubly awful. And now you have a financial reality that you have to deal with, which also is horrible. And that, I mean, that's the life cycle of anything that's not pretty successful, right? And that's the majority of outcomes. I've been fortunate where I've found pretty decent outcomes along the journey, but I absolutely had some of those moments. And that's why I tend to try to be really pragmatic and practical when I talk about our industry. There is a time where I focused on what I wanted to be true and what emotionally really like I wanted to happen. And what I've realized is that it's a business at its core. And unless I'm doing indie developer where I'm just doing it for the clear creative expression of it, it's a business. And trying to place all of the things that I care about in the context of a strong, valid business argument is the thing that has really changed most about me throughout my career. And it makes me, I think, more practical and pragmatic as a leader. It makes me more decisive around the things that we can do. But this is where we were talking about the layoff stuff. Like, man, I don't know how to express how terrible it feels to be a creative leader and fail your team. And to the people that are handling that with a lack of grace, that sucks. And it hurts their reputation and it'll hurt their ability to get good people into the future. But depression's a real thing.
Yeah.
Sure. and people dealing with failure, it's not their best moment. Doesn't mean it's excusable. It does mean that's at least understandable. Right.
Yeah. Very empathetic. I like it. It's true. Everyone's just a person trying to do their best at their job every day for the most part. I want to talk about your other company too, PlexChat. So you were at MZ for a while. You went startup founder to working at big-ish company. How big were they?
They were into the hundreds at that point. Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty reasonably sized.
Yeah. And then you seem to just love to do the opposite thing. And so you started another company. How did that come about?
I mean, I had a brilliant idea. I thought there should be a Slack for gamers. I still feel very confident in that idea. I'm really happy that Discord got the chance to do it. I really believe strongly that community was just going to be a bigger and bigger part of how the games industry worked. And I felt like it was because I saw demographics shifting because of the phone and its accessibility. Like playing games was no longer gated behind owning a PC and internet connection and a bunch of other like high expense, not necessarily like commodity things that every household would have. But the phone was something that everyone was going to have. And they would have access and constantly be playing. So in my mind, I felt like there was just going to be this deep connection between how people wanted to talk about their interests and their hobbies. I was looking at like Reddit and Dig way back in the day, and I'm like, there is more here. And then I saw Slack pop up, and Slack was sort of like additional confirmation for something that I've been seeing in a number of different like Asian chat apps around like Line and Kakao. And so I've been studying all of those WeChat, like all of those ecosystems. I think something like this will happen out here. And I think I was right. I feel pretty good about the assessment, but there's just a reality, which is like very few ideas are novel. And I think Discord really did a fantastic job of executing in the space that I saw the opportunity for. So ultimately I pivoted the business to be much more around how do you manage a network of communities, a portfolio of communities? How do you think about that? And that was where PlexChat was at when we ultimately moved towards the sale. But that would be an example of like seeing the opportunity, timing, resourcing was just a bit off, and ultimately having to like pivot and figure out how to make a decent outcome out of missing what was originally the primary goal.
It's funny to hear you talk about it in that light, because for me, I just look, I'm like, oh, wow, Shawn sold another company and then he sold it to Warner Brothers. And I think that's amazing. So it's funny to hear you and your reality.
Yeah. There's a lot of ways to, I think, frame and build clout and reputation and do things, right? I know how lucky I've been. I'm pretty smart. I'm pretty hardworking, but I know that my career is like a set of like opportunities that I got to take advantage of. This is where it goes all the way back to the beginning of Fortis, where it's like, there's some Shawn equivalent sitting in some part of the world that is just not going to get those opportunities. But if we gave him those opportunities, then that would be another piece of talent that would be happy and motivated and working with us. And then ultimately they would build a real career ideally for them. And we got to be a part of that. I love that about games. Like I really love about the potential. And that's part of what like motivates me around Fortis. Because again, I worked hard, but I just pivoted into video games a year before social and mobile games started. Right. And I had a good network that allowed me to recover from being laid off. And then I had a network that allowed me to help sell companies. Right. Yeah, I've been successful and I'm good at what I do, but you know, I've been good and it's been a multiplier on the opportunities that were available to me. And I think it's ideal to create more opportunities for more people.
I like that. That's really inspiring. Okay, I have one last question, and I want to point people to your website, fortisgames.com, Fortis. You touched on this a little bit, but every successful person is successful because of all of the people that have helped them along the way. So who do you feel like has really helped you the most in your games career? And is there any specific advice that they've given you that it's like a eureka moment for you?
Sure. Well, listen, I certainly have to call out my wife's influence throughout the entire process. She and I met when we were freshmen in college, and we've been together ever since. But she took very rough material and was like, I think I can work with this, and then kind of honed it over time, sanded some of the edges. And I think it made me like a much more effective and empathetic person. So credit to her there. I have had, one working partner through most of the companies. There's a woman named Carol Liao. I mentioned her briefly before. She's our SVP of game development here at Fortis. And I think it's less about the things that she said, and it's more about like how she showed up and demonstrated partnering and collaboration throughout time. I have a certain style. I'm very reasonable in this call. I try to be reasonable, but at the end of the day, I'm some blend between what you see on the blogs and what you see in this conversation, right? Which is, I like to drive, right? I like to find a way to move forward and to solve problems and to push and to get more out of people. And I think Carol has shown like a way of partnering and collaboration that has more balance in it than I think I probably would have like naturally gravitated towards. And that's why I like to work with her because she balances me out. She also demonstrates, I think, a degree of sophistication in how you invest in people and bring them along the journey. So yeah, if I'm going to shout anyone out, it's got to be Carol. I'm here in part because she supported me along the way.
That's sweet. How did you find Carol?
Carol was already at Playmesh when I arrived. She was the wife of one of the founders. She was working to help. She went through, I think, like 70 jobs while she was there, just finding ways to help. And she was one of those people where if you gave her something, she would find a way to make progress on it. And if that meant reading 10 books and studying every single thing, like she would do that. And she just consistently did that and got stronger and stronger around how she thought about more and more systems. And she became so flexible. She had been entrepreneurial before that herself. She had run her own thing. And so she just had a lot of potential. You have to look for the potential, right? You could always just decide a person's potential is defined by the fact that they come from some certain background with some set of, ingrained advantages. And what I've just found is like the best people to to build companies around are the ones that just fight, like they fight for it. They constantly fight for it. They bet on themselves and they fight for it. They take chances. They try, right? Because it's an inherently hard, ambiguous, shifting battleground when you're trying to build a company. And having other people that are also oriented in that way, I think, makes the potential for what's possible much greater. And then your flexibility also much greater in case things don't always work out. So yeah, I'd say generally she's like more on the production and operation side, like how to run the teams and how to really build systems that allow you to scale and effectively understand what you are doing and why. But yeah, I think I could throw her at pretty much anything and she figured it out. So
Congrats on finding her. That's the dream team. So nice when you have somebody that you can work with.
yeah, don't recruit her away from me.
Okay, right. That wasn't my plan.
Unless it's a really great job, then fine, do it. She wants to work in, then fine. Like, yeah, I'd be happy for her to be happy.
Watch what you say, Shawn. We've been talking to Shawn Foust, who's the COO of Fortis Games. Shawn, where can people go to see different pictures that could be your LinkedIn profile, vote on them, read your blogs, interact with you?
Listen, if you're still here at this point, then you should apply to Fortis if you think you have something to contribute and it makes sense. If you're still here and you're currently out of work and looking, keep trying. I've been there before. Fortis may not be the solution, but companies are getting formed every day. So I know a lot of folks out there I see in the LinkedIn feed, and I wish them all the best of luck. And to everyone that's on the other side of that equation, I hope you find a way to handle it as gracefully as you can.
Yeah.
There you go. Thanks, Lizzie. Appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for listening to the show this week. To catch all the latest from Here's Waldo, you can follow us on LinkedIn. Be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. We'll see you next time.